Napoleon, like anyone can even know that.
Hi friends, welcome to today's lesson. In today's lesson, we're gonna do something that's kind of like an optional alternate route to what we did in the previous video. Now you can remember in the previous video, we gave ourselves a lot of liberties because we generated a payload and we simply transferred the payload over as if we were already able to control the victim system. Now in a red team scenario, since we really want to focus on the post-exploitation side of things, that's okay. At the same time, I feel like we can make this process a little bit more nuanced, but all with the goal of more accurately reflecting what we would expect to see eventually as defenders. So very briefly, instead of just generating the payload and transferring it over, what we'll do is we'll run a script which really simulates what you would expect to see in a phishing email. And this script is not malicious in and of itself, but it does two important things. The first thing it does is a very rudimentary form of detection evasion, because what it's going to do is this script will try to ascertain whether or not Microsoft Defender is running on the target system. Now, if it detects that Microsoft Defender is indeed running on the target system, then it will not go and execute the second part of the script. Conversely, if it detects that Microsoft Defender real-time protection is not running, then it will continue the rest of the script. And what the rest of the script does is basically two simple things. It goes out to a web server and downloads the actual malicious payload, i.e. the actual code that will establish the C2 connection. And then of course, once it's downloaded it, it will run that code to form our connection. Right, and that's it guys. Simple, but I really think this is an important concept to grasp so that you better understand what you would expect to see in reality as a blue teamer. And in case blue teaming is not your thing, if you're starting out as a red teamer, this is also an excellent way to start learning how to craft actual malicious payloads which can work instead of simply cheating and transferring the payload over. So that's enough dilly-dallying for now. Let's get to it. So the first thing, let's just run PowerShell. And I'm actually even just going to pin it to my taskbar so we don't have to look for it again in the future. And let's run that as admin. Right, so the first thing I want to do is just run the following command. And, I know this is so obvious, it probably doesn't even need to be said. But this is obviously not a malicious command. This is a command anyone can run in PowerShell. And what this is going to do, it'll give us an overview of a lot of important details related to Windows Defender. But specifically in this case, what we're interested in is real-time protection, right? And we can see this is false, and that's obviously because we turned MS Defender off, right? And so from the attacker's point of view, if we landed on a system and we ascertained that this property is false, then we could say, go ahead and download and install the malicious code. Conversely, if we wrote a script which basically ascertained that this is true, then it would probably say don't download and execute the script because we most likely get caught, and then we'd basically blow our opportunity to perhaps get a shell on another box where MS Defender might be disabled. Alright, so how would we actually go ahead and do something like this? Right, so let's build on this command a little bit. And we can see here, we're basically going to run the same query, and then we'll get that output, obviously, this output. And then we're going to pipe it to the following command, which is basically going to check whether or not real-time protection enable is false. And so what happens when we run this command? Well, we can actually see that we pretty much get the exact same output than we did here. So what's going on here? Well, basically, this command just checks whether or not this condition is true. And if it is true, then it will output the results. So because this is false, and because it is actually false, real-time protection, it goes ahead and outputs the results. Conversely, if I change this to true, there's no output. And the reason there's no output is because this conditional is false, and because it is not true, it does not output the results. So just to review, our command will return data when the condition is true, and if the condition is false, it won't return anything. So now perhaps we can even start really thinking about how we could potentially use this for defense evasion, right? We can basically say, okay, if some data is returned, i.e. if real-time protection enabled is false, then execute code, and if no data is returned, do nothing. So just think of a basic if statement. If we think of something like this, right, in PowerShell. And what this basically means is we have X, which is our condition, and we have Y, which is basically the code to execute. And this basically says that if X is true, if data is returned, i.e. if real-time protection enabled is false, then go ahead and execute this code. So let's go ahead and actually build this out for ourselves. So we know now from what we just saw that basically our condition will be to check whether or not real-time protection enabled is false. So we've already covered that. And you probably already understand exactly what that means. Right? And now we have, in case this is true, we want to execute this. Why? So before we actually get to the full command where we're actually going to download and execute the malicious code, instead, let's just write out a very simple message, just so that for now we can just test the code as a proof of concept to see that it works. But this code won't work as it is right now because we basically need to tell it exactly what to do. We want to use PowerShell and we run a command. We'll wrap this all in quotation marks. And then inside of here, we'll have another curly brackets and we'll say and inside of here, we're simply going to plunk down our entire condition and code to execute, right? And then one other thing I'm going to add here, this is not strictly necessary, but I'm just going to add pause because this will actually kind of freeze the output so that we can actually see our message here. It worked. And we can basically prove to ourselves that our command will work. So I'm going to save this as a bat file and we'll call it resume. .bat, because everyone knows that a resume is always a bat file. So I'll minimize this and we'll just double click and run this. And we can see there our command ran and it had some output. And now it's pausing and I just added that so that we could actually see this output. Otherwise, basically it will open and close immediately. Right. So now we have our proof of concept, but now let's go ahead and turn this into something we can actually use. In other words, let's change this from simply outputting and telling us that it worked. Let's go ahead and actually change this part so that it goes and downloads the malicious payload from a web server and then executes it. Right, so I'm back on our Kali system, and if you can remember in the previous video, we created this malicious payload, right? And this malicious payload is what's going to call back and catch the connection with our listener on our attacker system. And so we can go ahead and simply reuse the same payload. Right, so let's just run a server again. This is now simulating, our malicious web server that's hosting our payload. And then let's get back on our victim system. Okay, and so back on our victim system, we can obviously see the kind of simple script that we wrote. And now the final thing we want to do is basically change this, which is the code that will execute if the condition is found to be true. And so right there, we want to enter our new code, i.e. the code that will basically go and download and execute the malicious payload that we just created and that is now being hosted on the web server on our Kali Linux system. And so before I actually go and plonk it inside of the command, just so it's easier to see, in PowerShell, we can use invoke web request to download a file. To this, we have to specify the URI. And so we know the IP in this case is obviously referring to our Kali Linux system, 190. And the port, if you recall, on our web server is 8000. Now it's going to go there and look for the name of the file. The name of our malicious payload is resume.exe. Sorry, I got to come up with some more creative names, I guess. And then we will use out file to specify where we want to save the file as what. And we'll save it in Windows temp. And we'll just go ahead and save it as resume.exe. So that's part 1 of 2, which is download the malicious payload. But downloading and saving the malicious payload is obviously not enough. What we need to then also do is execute the payload, right? And to do this is very simple. We'll basically just add a second command. We'll literally just actually call the exe and tell it to run. So to be clear, quickly, right here, we're going to go to the web server and download this file. We're going to save it there as resume.exe, and then there we're just actually going to run it. So that's everything we needed to do. So I'm going to cut that. And of course now, instead of just getting a message, what we want it to do is execute this new command. And this time we can remove pause. We don't need that anymore because we'll know by virtue of having a new active session whether or not our script worked, right? So let's minimize this. And before I run this, guys, I want to say that obviously now we've just gone ahead and created the script at our leisure on the victim system. What would this look like in reality? In reality, we'd have a phishing email. The phishing email will have a Word document attached to it. It will have VBA macros enabled. And this exact same code will just be embedded inside of a malicious Word document. And so if a victim opens an attachment and enables macros, this code will execute. But we're not going to construct that whole elaborate setup. Instead, we are allowing ourselves the leisure of simply double-clicking it, right? And so it ran. So let's get back on our Kali system and see if we got a shell. And indeed, we can see right there, guys, that we got our shell. And now, of course, if we want to do, we can go ahead and use the new session that was just created. Alright guys, so that's really it for today. Like I said, this wasn't strictly necessary, but I like adding this one additional step because it actually more realistically approximates what would happen in an actual attack. And in this case, for us as detection engineers and for us as threat hunters, this step actually matters because some of the evidence and diagnostic data that we'll look for and pick up on will differ depending on whether or not this additional step was enacted. And so in our next video that I will release shortly, what we're going to do now is we're going to start right here with our meterpreter shell, and we're going to start looking at some of the things we like to do once we have a shell as an attacker or as a red teamer. I hope to see you there. It's obviously going to be awesome. And until then,
Peace out.